Hey everyone, and welcome back to a new video. We've just had the release of the first book in the new Age of Sigmar Dawnbringers series, Harbingers, which sets the scene for the coming campaign, and in this video I wanted to explore the book and explain how that story plays out, who are the main characters, and where does Harbingers leave the story ahead of the release of book 2. Naturally there will be spoilers, so if you're keen to read through the story yourself, then take your time and come back to this video when you're done. With all that said though, let's jump in and discuss what exactly happens in Harbingers. So as you might expect, the story opens up with a bit of a scene setter. All of the realms in Age of Sigmar are scarred by conflict and war, but they've grown even more so recently following the events of the Broken Realms series. You may recall that that series ended with the earthquake god Kragnos escaping from his prison and leading a war against the city of Excelsis in Gur, nearly obliterating the city in the process and beginning what is now the era of the beast. That said, something is beginning to stir the various races of the mortal realms, and the book tells us that those threats aren't just the ones beyond Sigmar's city walls, but also those within. Corruption and vendettas are running rife among the God King's people and posing as much a danger as the force of destruction, death and chaos. However, Harbingers focuses on two particular realms, Giran and Akshi, and specifically the city of Hammerhal, known as the Twin-Tailed City. If you're not familiar with Hammerhal, it's one of the most important cities for the followers of Sigmar, a spiritual capital, and it's broken into two halves, Hammerhal Aksha and Hammerhal Gira, which sit on either side of a realm gate joining the two. It's kind of one city, but each half has embraced different characteristics of the realms of Giran and Akshi, making them feel more like separate ones. But anyways, the reason we're focusing on Hammerhal is because a plague has begun to set in amongst the people of the two realms, and it's quite a unique one. Rather than simply kill you, this plague causes a deep apathy to set in, leading people to give up on their lives and responsibilities, regardless of the repercussions. The book talks of soldiers being executed because of a catatonic refusal to follow orders, and priests being burnt for sedition because they won't repeat the religious propaganda of Sigmar's most devout followers. And on that note, if things weren't bad enough, there's a bit of a propaganda war taking place too. Dawnbringer crusades have been marching out into the realms for some time with mixed success. Some have established new settlements, but many others have failed, and even some of those already established settlements have begun to fall. Naturally, those with power and influence in Sigmar's territories are keen to maintain them, so whispers of tragedy are being silenced by a mix of harsh punishments and zealous pamphlets and declarations. However, beneath this turbulent mix of chaos and political intrigue, gears are secretly in motion. In the foundries of Hammerhal, weapons are being made on a scale never seen before, and sermons are calling for a grand venture of conquest and revival. Sigmar's forces are about to go on the offensive, if their enemies don't stop them first, that is. Turning to our first setting, Giran, the battle between Alariel, the goddess of life, and Nurgle, the chaos god of decay, rages on. Alariel suspects that this new plague, known as the Shudder Blight, is one of Nurgle's creation, and is keen to stop it enveloping Giran as it spreads across the realm. So she calls upon a purifying rain to cleanse Sigmar's people, their settlements, and the crops and agriculture they live on. In fact, the territory of Verdia, where Hammerhal Gira is situated, is the breadbasket of Sigmar's empire, highlighting why Nurgle would have such an interest in spoiling it. However, Alariel's plan works for a while, and Sigmar's people rejoice as newfound optimism takes hold alongside their usual crusading verve and spirit. However, this is where we see our first clear examples of the corruption within Sigmar's empire. There's an interesting side story about how Alariel's rain collects in these floating islands called metalliths that drift across the realm, and those rains then fall onto the crops below, creating bountiful harvests. So, as you would expect, all of the merchants start fighting over these metalliths, seeking to chain them to their own lands and use Alariel's blessing to get a bit more profit from their harvests. Even in war, there's always someone seeking to make an extra coin or two. Of course, Nurgle doesn't take kindly to Alariel's evocation and calls upon a rain of his own, one of gelid liquids that reduce everything they touch to stinking filth. This becomes known as the Jewel of Rains, and a sort of stalemate forms between the two deities. Over in Hammerhal though, Lady Nadian Greenspur, the matriarch Giranis, realises that at some point Alariel's rains will have to stop, and the Shudder Blight will take hold of Giran's people once again. Plus, the rains are only holding off the plague on the surface. Underground, Nurgle's followers are festering and growing, a precursor to a likely invasion. So she makes a difficult decision. She calls back as many warriors as she can from the various strong points across Giran, seeking to bolster Hammerhal Gira's own forces. This leaves many of the settlements completely defenceless, something the Stormcast take offence to, and they try, largely in vain, to hold back the tide of threats that eventually consume those settlements one by one. And yet among amongst the reports of casualties and losses, Greenspur also hears rumours of settlements in northern Verdia being found with signs of battle and half-devoured corpses strewn everywhere. Indeed, there's no sign of life except for a massive tracks leaving the towns and etchings of graffiti thanking a noble Sigerian who proclaims allegiance to a summer king, but we'll come back to that later. We then get a glimpse into the followers of Nurgle, and specifically these Harbingers of Decay that have begun to appear across the realm. The Harbingers have been around for centuries, but have only now begun to marshal in greater numbers as the spreaders of the Shudderblight. Interestingly, it seems they're acting at the behest of the Varangard, Archaon's own inner circle, and while they and their deity certainly have a score to settle with Alarielle, it's curious that the actual plan might stem from another foe altogether. But in any case, as the Duel of Reigns wages on, the Harbingers use Nurgle's deluge to spread the Shudderblight more quickly. They do this through a special ritual called the 7 Strokes of Doom, where each settlement they come across is met by 7 terrible omens. These omens change from Harbinger to Harbinger, but may include fresh water congealing into pus and bile, and livestock succumbing to disease and decay. The first and final omen are always the same though, the Harbinger being spotted on the far horizon and the arrival of their forces to butcher the Plague's inhabitants. This carefully laid out ritual ultimately magnifies Nurgle's presence in the realm, helping him to battle Alarielle's efforts. However, it requires settlements to be inhabited, or else the blessings simply don't work. And that's where the Harbinger Fulgoth the Miser comes in. In northern Verdia, he finds that the spread of the Shudderblight is slowing, and that settlements that should be targets for their omens are instead being found barren, both in terms of life and spiritual energy. More so, there are whispers of a Surgerian who is mustering resistance in Verdia. Fulgoth is naturally perturbed by this, but his divinations lead him to the strong point of Furtherfield, where he and his army ride out ahead of Nurgle's reigns to butcher the people according to the 7 Strokes of Doom. Then he waits. It's then at around dusk of the final day that signs of life appear on the horizon. A regal army is seen marching towards the fallen settlement, with an ornamented figure carrying a golden rod of office at its head. This seems to be the Surgerian that Fulgoth has heard of. However, as dusk gives way and the moonlight becomes the only source of illumination, the visage of the army falls away to reveal a warbling horde of cannibalistic ghouls, and at their head, what was once the epitome of a noble knight now appears as a scythe-clutching, bone-strewn figure. The ghoul announced himself as the bearer of the Summer King's missive and is incredibly articulate for one of his kind. He accuses Fulgoth of being the sorcerer who has brought so much pain and despair to the region's inhabitants, and that it is the heroism of him and his fellow envoys, other Marrow Scroll heralds like Gerion, that have mustered armies of serfs to his master's cause. The Harbinger of Decay doesn't countenance much of a conversation, but he sees the threat for what it is. With these ghouls rampaging about, the growth of the Shudderblight and the armies of the Maggotkin will be impeded, and that cannot be allowed. So it comes to blows. Fulgoth's army, though outnumbered, tears into Gerion's assembly, and it's brutal. Blight Kings laugh with Nurgle's characteristic joviality as they scythe through ranks of ghouls, while muscular crypt horrors collide with plague knights, pulping their demon flymounts in sprays of gore and pus. However, Fulgoth keeps his cool and makes a beeline straight for Gerion. However, he doesn't seek direct combat. Instead, he draws a rusted knife, a blade blessed by Nurgle himself and the source of the Shudderblight for each Harbinger, and levels it at the herald. With a glossal invocation, a wave of anguish and shattered hope shoots from the blade and strikes Gerion with the full might of the plague. Gerion begins to grow pale, and he and other ghouls around him fall to their knees as the delusions that drive them begin to fall apart. Some ghouls even become aware of what they've become and slay themselves in despair. But as it seems Gerion is about to succumb, he raises a piece of splintered bone above him and cracks it. A blinding flash consumes the battlefield, and a cacophony of visions and madness strike the minds of the Maggotkin. Conversely, the ghouls are driven into a frenzy and the battle turns in an instant. Blight Kings are dragged down in a tide of cannibalistic fury, and every side swing is met by a new wave of maddened undead. Fulgoth realises that while the battle could still be won, the prize of the settlement is meaningless, so instead he decides to retreat and warn his brethren of this new threat and to make preparations for the battles to come. Our final glimpse of Gerion is of him howling with his disciples, howls of devotion to the King of Summer and Carrion. The story then pans out and gives us a glimpse of the other realms and what is happening there. In a sentence, it's not great. Armies of grots, greenskins and demented undead are rising up everywhere, and even the lands of the Lumineth aren't free from the fate of settlements like Furtherfield. But similarly, armies of Fireslayers, Caradron and Elves are joining their Sigmarite allies where they can, even descending into the realm of Olgu to reclaim land in spite of the losses they have taken. It's a mixed picture, and I think it teases quite nicely what will be coming in future books in the series. But But just as quickly, the action turns to Akshi, where the Shudderblight Plague has also begun to take root, but not with as much potency as it did in Giran. Still, it does affect the city's industrial districts, hampering its creation of weapons and materials ahead of the still secret Twin Tail Crusade. Of course, Alariel can't do much for the people of Hammerhal Aksha, and despite some attempts to smuggle blessed water from Giran through the Realm Gate, the people simply tackle it in the best way they know how, by zeal and reckless determination. In essence, they just power through the plague. This is simply a short-term solution though, so Zamta Feloria, a member of the Archmage Collegium, calls upon the burner cults of Hammerhal to erect massive arcane pyres at specific parts of the city. These ministered fires would produce an aura that would burn away the corruption from areas around them and give some respite to those working and living across Hammerhal Aksha. However, as you would expect from a zealous people, it isn't long before anything deemed corrupt finds itself not just brought to the fires for cleansing, but thrown into them. Supposedly cursed artifacts and even spurned lovers and business rivals were all consigned to the flame, and often without much evidence. Ironically, with pyromania gripping the hearts of the zealous, many people find themselves without any homes or possessions, and that forces thousands to join the Dawnbringer Crusades simply to find some remnants of a home. It's at this point that our third character comes into the picture, Fiori. He's the last surviving member of his magma hold and the bearer of Guzenhold's sacred flame, the closest connection and remnants they have of their god Grimnir. To give him his proper title, he is a Grimhold exile, and he comes to Hammerhal Aksha honour bound by an oath of alliance between Guzenhold and the city to inform its leaders of its fate. Hammerhal's Grand Enclave though is too busy to listen to such perceived doommongering, and so they refuse to grant him an audience. This enrages many of the Fyreslayers who joined Fiori on his travels to the city, and many say they should let it suffer for its petulance. But Fiori stands firm. They'll wait for as long as it takes for the conclave to listen. The scene then shifts to further out in Akshi, where it's revealed that Dawnbringer Crusades have started to create underground settlements following their conquests. Part of this is because the realm is so inhospitable to many, it's covered in blazing magma and ash, but wizards have also discovered subterranean magical nexuses, and that has drawn the attention of the Dawners. These new settlements, however, have upset many of the Grots, Troggoths and Skaven that have lived up to this point untested under the surface, and so intense battles break out between the conquering Sigmarites and the infuriated Grots and Troggoths. The latter are known for their ferocity, even when human and Dwarden aren't muscling in on their lairs, but the arrival of the Rabble Rousers, a new type of greenskin agitator blessed by Gorka Morka with voices that can boom across the battlefield, only drives this frenzy to new heights. One such rouser is Braggett Big Talker, an obnoxious little grot with a big estimation of himself. He claims to have woken the most colossal Troggoth ever seen in the realms, a story that many don't believe but aren't quite brave enough to question. In any case, Braggett's raucous commands only rile his kin up more and more, and soon hordes of Grots and Troggoths gather around their newfound leader and march on the warpath to their first target, the underground Dorner settlement of Grafer. Grafer is a township of glassblowers, and given how much interest Grots have in glass, it made it an easy target for the raging hordes. Bottles were smashed and settlers butchered, and a great sense of victory overwhelms Braggett and his followers. And then they learn that the settlement is likely supplying Hammerhal Aksha with the bottles, so as to store the mystical water of Aqua Garanis, an important commodity for the city's economy. The economics don't matter much to Braggett though. All that matters is that there's more glass in the city, and so the army storms it from underground using tunnels that even the Dawners weren't aware of, and emerge from right under the city's glass foundry. Chaos erupts, and it's not long before the entire foundry is ablaze. Glass and intricate equipment is smashed to pieces by charging Troggoths, and Grots run through the streets, causing as much mayhem as possible. The city's Free Guild detachments respond as best they can, hemming the advance of the Grots and keeping them from getting out into the wider city. And yet, with the foundry ablaze, those same troops can't get close enough to smother the inferno. The heat and the flames are just too intense. So the city's prime commander, Catric Leguilon, calls for Fiori and his fellow Fyreslayers and asks for their help in tackling the blaze. Some Fyreslayers say that this is a rich punishment for ignoring Fiori's warnings, but the Grimhold exile silences them, reminding them of the oaths of alliance that his magma hold had sworn with Hammerhal. And so the Fyreslayers march into the city's industrial quarter. Fleeing civilians part before them, all while the Free Guild try their best to keep the Grots and Troggoths in check. But soon, Fiori and his kin find themselves outside the blazing glass foundry. The heat would have incinerated the clothing and flesh of any normal warrior, but the Fyreslayers are born amidst searing flames, and blessed with runes etched into their flesh that protect them from such infernos. Still, the flames are punishing even for them. Braggett's army, in contrast, seems to simply ignore the blaze around them. They're too busy dragging glass back to their pit or whooping as Troggoths and Squigs bound around the place, smashing everything they can find. As the Fyreslayers advance into the foundry, an intense melee breaks out. The enmity between Greenskins and Dwarden is legendary, and each strike down the warriors of the other with as much hatred as they can muster. But as flames and blade blaze across the foundry, Fury locks eyes with Braggett, who is lingering near the mouth of their sinkhole. In an instant, Braggett roars for his minions to surround the exile, and his Gobapalooza channel waves of clammy energies to thrust at the Dwarden. Thanks to his protective runes though, the waves of pure spite simply fizzle out, but he still has to battle through waves of bodies as the Grots and Troglodytes throw themselves at him. Swing after swing of his blessed hammers caves in skull after skull, but still the hordes press on, and soon Fury finds himself surrounded. He fights with all the strength he has, but the numbers are too great. A spear stabs at his ribs, and a Squig catches two of his fingers before he can pulp it to the floor, and then piercing down from on high, a Bat Squig darts down to tear out one of his eyes. It's not looking good for the Fyreslayer, and in what seems like his final moments, all he can hear is Braggett's whooping and sneering jeers. At that moment, the hammers in Fury's hands burst into life, filling his body with a new strength, and yelling an oath in ancient Zarkazalid, the exile smashes his two hammers together, and the foundry fills with a tempest of flame. Everything is reduced to ash. Grot, Troggoth and even Braggett, too late in realising what is happening, is cast back into the pit as half his body is ignited with a flame that blackens his armour and melts his flesh. Hearing the rabble-rouser's screams and curses as he flees back from whence he came, the spirit of his horde breaks and they follow him back into the pit. That sight is the very last thing Fury sees before he collapses into unconsciousness. We then reach a kind of conclusion to the Harbingers story with a brief look at the situations in Ghyran and Akshi. In the former, the actions of Geryon have inadvertently helped to break the stranglehold that Nurgle has on northern Verdia. His plague rains have slackened and Alariels have begun to heal the land, leaving it ripe for reconquest. And with a bolstered army, thanks to Greenspur's decision to recall warriors from the settlements, the forces of Ghyran have never been stronger. And so it's decided by the Conclave that one of the largest Dawnbringer crusades ever assembled will set out for northern Verdia and continue into the mountains of the Neck, ushering a new era of rebirth for Sigmar's empire. In Akshi, Fury's bravery sees him permitted to speak to the Conclave. He warns them of Troggoths that have laid waste to his home and those of his kin, and the threat they now pose to all civilization in the realm. Defences must be prepared, he argues, before the threat grows too large to turn back. Others on the council also agree, suggesting that to send out a Dawnbringer crusade could stir even more factions, uniting them against Sigmar's people and ushering a tide of destruction onto the unprepared city and settlements. And yet, ever dedicated to their own agenda, the Conclave takes a different view. Instead, they argue this is the perfect time to muster their forces, for to overcome the foe and pacify it will prove the legitimacy of Sigmar's empire beyond doubt. Like a javelin hurled by the God King himself, they will charge forth into Akshi's wild regions and burn the darkness from every nook and cranny, seizing it in Sigmar's name. And that then brings an end to the story of Harbingers, book 1 in the Dawnbringers series. Personally, I really like the way it has set up the story. It hasn't given too much away in terms of which crusade will succeed and which will fail, and we get a great glimpse into the threats outside Sigmar's empire and those within. Of course, it seems like things are literally about to kick off, with both crusades ready to set out, and that's where the action will really begin. But what did you make of the story in this first book, and what are you hoping to see from the rest of the series? Let me know in the comments section. And of course, thank you for joining me today. If you enjoyed the video, please do click the like button and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to join me for future Warhammer videos, including more on the Dawnbringers series, and I hope to see you for my next one. Until then though, take care.